No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened to his neck. Frederick Douglass, slave abolitionist and statesman.
In the 1600s, the native people of Africa and the Caribbean were forcibly brought to the Americas and enslaved for the purpose of providing a free workforce. Slave owners applied brutal acts of dehumanization in attempts to physically and emotionally control slaves. But many of the captured people sought freedom, all the while knowing that a failed escape would cost them a severe whipping, a chopped off leg, or death at the end of a rope. From the slavery era through the civil rights era, there were persons empowered only with the love of their fellow man and moral fiber, who paid steep personal costs in their quest to empower the disenfranchised. These great Americans fought slavery, Jim Crow laws, and racism in order to free people from a hell on earth and to rescue America from her immoral agenda. Those heroes and heroines paid for our freedom. This is their story.
Generally, when people are asked about the history of African people in America, who we've called Ausa, the Ausa tribe, the Africans in the United States of America, the thoughts generally turn to slavery. And it's a shame that during our lowest point, people see as our beginning, not understanding that we had thousands of years of glorious history. And actually, if you look at the history of the world, for most of the history of the world, there was peace and African people were in charge. Starting from ancient Egypt, which is been said to be in some nebulous place called the Middle East, but I often ask, middle of what and east of where? There's no reference point given. So Egypt is in Africa. When I was blessed to be able to go there, even some Egyptians didn't want to admit that they were Africans until you went down to the southern part of Egypt. And then you saw the monuments that many had been defaced, and you understood that the oldest of all the monuments and the pictures and the paintings were African people, unequivocally African people. So I think that when you think about the origins of mathematics, the origins of architecture, the origins of spirituality and religion itself, they are all due to the efforts of African people. When the first European explorers traversed the coast of Africa in the 11th and 12th century, they found civilizations that were actually superior to much of what was going on in Europe at that time. When the first Europeans came, they welcomed them. They adopted them into their families. They treated them kindly. And the Europeans repaid by bringing in priests and teachers. And the teachers offered to educate the children, understanding that the children would be the ones who were the investment in the future. Frequently, they would even take them to Europe, to Portugal, to Spain, to France, and they would teach them to hate themselves. They would teach them that the features that made them uniquely African were ugly. The interesting thing is that after such a warm welcome, the Africans were repaid in treachery by, as Dr. John Henry Clark says, enslaving the father and the child, killing the father, enslaving the child, and raping the mother. And those people were brought to America to work for nothing. Many of them perished during the Middle Passage, which was the voyage from Africa to America. And it's very, very important that we realize that slaves were not brought from Africa. Africans were brought from Africa and turned into slaves. And the way they were doing that was a process called seasoning. And the Africans were beaten and they were humiliated. They were treated in all sorts of literally brutal ways in order to break their spirits. Generation after generation, I think there was something like 15 to 17 generations of Africans who were enslaved. And those Africans underwent tremendous trauma.
I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one or two things I had a right to: liberty and death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. Harriet Tubman, slave abolitionist, freedom fighter.
But just think about 17 generations of living under barbaric conditions where your wife was not your wife, where your children could be sold away from you at any time, where on a whim you could be beaten, where on a whim you could be raped as well as your wife and your children. And there was absolutely nothing you could do about it.
Denmark Vesey, a slave in Charleston, South Carolina, purchased his freedom and then plotted to free slaves in Charleston, South Carolina, and sailed to Haiti. Before the revolt could be carried out, two slaves loyal to their owner reported the plot. On July the 2nd, 1822, Vesey and 34 of his supporters were hanged.
I think it's important to recognize that America's foundation rests on the institution of enslavement. I think the notion of American democracy, it is impossible to fully understand what that meant over time without understanding how slavery helped shape and develop our nation. I mean, slavery helped build the United States of America. It was a source of tremendous wealth for generations of white Americans. And so many people, as they envisioned power, as they envisioned themselves, they did not see that apart from the enslavement of millions of Africans. And so when one looks at the wealth of plantations, but not only that, the wealth of railroads, the wealth of banks, all of that rests on the profit driven from the exploitation of millions of African people.
White people's defense of the institution of slavery was based on the twin lies: white superiority, black inferiority. There is no Negro problem. The problem is whether the American people have loyalty enough, honor enough, patriotism enough to live up to its own constitution. Frederick Douglass.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure half slave, half free. Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States of America, June 16, 1858.
The real fear of the Confederates was the emancipation of black minds, black identities, black spirits, because that would prove the lie to the notion of inferiority. And so the fear was President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would be enforced, and that African Americans would elect, they would exercise their own independence, as many did, to be free people. And free people meant having access to education. Free people meant having access to the right to vote. It also meant property ownership. It meant the right for your own labor, your own wages. Because here you now have white people who are trying to preserve what they once had, which was the root of their identity. And here you have black people who are trying to move themselves away from generations of enslavement. And they are the majority of those who are emancipated. And so it is no irony that in the aftermath of the fall of the Confederacy, you have the rise of paramilitary organizations, you have the rise of militias, you have the rise of rifle clubs, and you have the rise of this extraordinary fraternity called the Ku Klux Klan, which was initially a reunion of Confederate soldiers who made it a point to exercise violence to try to circumscribe black rights and black aspirations. And you can see over time, they began to realize that the only way to curtail black freedom, you cannot do it at the ballot box. You cannot do it necessarily in the schoolhouse. But they thought and were proven successful that you could exercise a reign of terror on black people to strike up fear, to strike up unrest. And in places like South Carolina and Mississippi and other places where you have black majorities, that is how you unraveled Reconstruction.
We of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. We have never believed him to be the equal of the white man, and we will not submit to his gratifying his lust on our wives and daughters without lynching him. Benjamin R. Pitchfork Tillman, South Carolina Governor and U.S. Senator, March 23, 1900.
The thriving black enclave of Tulsa, commonly called Greenwood or Black Wall Street, bolstered its own hospital and over 200 businesses. May 30th, 1921, Dick Rowland, a black man, is accused of assaulting a white woman and is arrested. When the sheriff refuses to release Rowland to a mob of 2,000 whites, the mob goes on a rampage in Greenwood, burning 1,200 homes and looting another 250. Churches and 200 businesses are destroyed and 6,000 black residents arrested. The total number of deaths, white and black, vary from 33 to 300.
Blacks in Omaha, Nebraska are prospering. Competition for jobs between ethnic groups is fierce and racial tensions are at a boil. The local newspaper sensationalizes the alleged rape of a white woman by Will Brown, a black man, and Brown is arrested. Sunday, September 28, 1919, a white mob of about 4,000 takes Brown from his jail cell, hangs him, and burns his body. How long did it take for members of Will Brown's family to recover from the atrocity? When this boy became a man, did he resist teaching hatred to his own son?
The 2001 investigative report, Torn from the Land, by Associated Press writers Todd Lewin and Dolores Barclay, provides graphic and indisputable proof of how violent white land grabbers, dishonest white lawyers, and a legal but controversial practice called partitioning robbed blacks of their land.
For whom the bell tolls, no man is an island entire to itself. Each is a piece of the continent, a piece of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. As well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thine own or of thine friends were. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, sin not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. Sir John Donne's powerful poem reminds us that we are one. And when one dies, we all die a little. And likewise, when one of us triumphs, we all profit. The bell doesn't toll to mark the death of a community servant, but instead to honor his or her death and to challenge the next generation to a life of service.
Mr. Harry T. Moore and his wife, Harriet Moore, founded the Brevard County, Florida chapter of the NAACP and committed their lives to fighting injustice. The cost of their commitment was death. On Christmas night, 1951, their 25th wedding anniversary, the Ku Klux Klan firebombed their home, killing them both. No one was ever prosecuted for the murders.
I'm Cresswell Elmore. My father was George Elmore, the middle initial A, as you like to be referred to. My father was a very successful entrepreneur. He started a number of businesses in Columbia, South Carolina. He was a 5 and 10 cent store owner there on Gervais Street. From there, he had a liquor store at Millwood and Gervais. He did photography. He was a photographer where he did photographs for the Booker T. Washington High School yearbooks, as well as Waverly Elementary School. And he had a fleet of, or not a fleet, but he had 4 taxi cabs on the Blue Ribbon Taxi Cab fleet. Although my father was pretty successful and prosperous in his business adventures, he was not a very happy man because he was one that was always sort of leading the community in being an activist. We weren't referred to as activists back then, but he was not pleased that he paid poll taxes, and as a payer of poll taxes, he was unable to vote in the Democratic primaries.
It is time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union. It is time to fall in step with other states and adopt the American way of conducting elections. U.S. District Judge J. Wades Waring.
The lawsuit brought tremendous reprisals to the family. We suffered severely, my dad, as a result of the losses. The economic impact to him was that the businesses were all destroyed pretty much. The alcohol and tobacco folks from Columbia came in at the liquor store and broke up all the liquor as a result of the case being rendered. He was no longer able to get credit from any of the suppliers that supplied products for the 5 and 10 cent store. And we had, of course, the Klan burn crosses in front of the houses. We had a tremendous impact on the family and the community. Although he was successful in the winning of the lawsuit, there were people in the community, as a result of the lawsuit, thought that he had gained success because there was a dollar figure associated with the lawsuit. Back then, it was a $5,000 reward that was supposed to have been awarded to my dad as a result of the winning of the lawsuit. But there were people in the community that shied away from my father as a result of, one, thinking that he had this extra money, and two, because of the reprisals that they were afraid of would come to them as a result of being associated with my father. So there were black people in the community that stayed away from us, denied our abilities to be part of them, and ran from us. And of course, my mother ultimately sacrificed her health. She had a nervous breakdown as a result of that. And the banks came in, and the mortgages that we had on the home, they called the mortgages, of course, and he couldn't pay the mortgages off, so we lost the homes that we were living in, and then we had to ultimately leave the area. My mother sacrificed, had a nervous breakdown in 1952, and she was hospitalized from 52 until her death. As a result of losing the homes, my father decided that he would leave Columbia because of the economic pressure that had been borne on him as a result of the lawsuit. We packed up things that we had in the house. In fact, there are some people in Columbia today that still have a couple of the mementos from my father's home. But we left and we went to Washington, D.C. in 1955 and stayed there for a year with an aunt. And of course, my father did not like the North. That was the North to him. We ultimately came back to Columbia after spending a year in Washington with myself, my father, and my two sisters. My older sister was living in New York at the time, but we came back. Of course, we didn't have anywhere to live. And a first cousin of mine who took care of us, my father, myself, and my two sisters, allowed my two sisters to live in her home, in Saxon's home, home, and my father and I lived in a panel truck that we put a box spring and mattress in the back of, and we slept in the back of the truck while my two sisters lived in Saxon homes with my first cousin, and I went to school on the back of a truck for about 6 or 7 months before we got home to live in.
In spite of death threats, Mississippi NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers worked nonstop in order to increase black voter registration in his state. Evers so loved the concept of freedom, he felt the possible gains far outweighed the risk. Jimmy Lee Jackson was an ordinary man with extraordinary convictions. February the 8th, 1965, he's demonstrating for voting and human rights in Marion, Alabama, when a law enforcement officer viciously attacks his mother. Jackson attempts to pull the officer off his mother, and he's shot 2 times. The 26-year-old Jackson dies 8 days later. Marchers are staged on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, to begin the 48-mile trek to Montgomery. Alabama state troopers and Dallas County deputies attack the peaceful and defenseless marchers. Bloody Sunday. Mrs. Viola Liuzzu, a Detroit, Michigan housewife, arrives in Selma to assist with the 3rd scheduled march to Montgomery. It's her attempt to pay tribute to Jimmy Lee Jackson. March 25th, 1965. A successful Selma to Montgomery march concludes, and Mrs. Liuzzu is driving back to Selma with a fellow volunteer, Leroy Moulton, a black man. A car carrying 4 Ku Klux Klansmen pulls next to her car. She's felled by 2 bullets to the head.
The bell tolls for Mrs. Viola Liuzzu, who sacrificed her life for me and generations unborn.
Clarendon County was an area within South Carolina that was quite poor. As a matter of fact, it was one of the poorest counties in the nation at that time. There were very few blacks that lived there that had anything beyond a third grade education. And their plight was very typical of the extremes among Negroes in the South at that time. My father had been doing whatever he could to help. My father and mother were doing this in terms of special tutoring for children, recognizing the fact that children need medical services and getting them to Columbia, which seemed to be the only place in the state that had any decent services at the time, for treatments, and in some cases underwriting the costs themselves. It was very obvious in the county that the opportunities were not there for black folk. The schools were inadequate or non-existent in some areas. And I'm not sure that my father or the people there recognized that they were headed towards desegregation. But what they wanted was improvement. And what they recognized was, I don't have an education, so I've got to sharecrop. But if I can get my children a decent education, they won't have to sharecrop and break their backs like I did. And that seemed to be a great goal that maybe they could reach within their lifetime. Maybe the desegregation, if you thought about it, they'd say you're dreaming, it won't come in my lifetime. But there was a dream of something improving that gave them hope. And they looked at my father as one who could help them or carry them into this kind of effort.
Harry and Eliza Briggs and the remainder of the lawsuit plaintiffs originally set out to acquire school buses for black students, but the focus of their suit evolved into the dismantling of the separate but equal doctrine, the foundation of educational injustice.
As the challenges began or started with the Briggs v. Elliott case, things were consistent. People were fired. People that were suspect with the case was fired. The state made it illegal to belong to the NAACP, and teachers were fired because they belonged to the NAACP or they were suspected to have belonged to the NAACP. For instance, Operation Starve, where they were in Clarendon County, they wouldn't sell black folk groceries at the grocery store. And so all of the people that were involved in this were penalized in some way. And even with my family, yes, they were, I think, the most harshly penalized in it. But this did not deter people. There were times when the black men of the communities in Clarendon County where we lived, or in black men from Clarendon County, I should say, not just that one community, guarded our house with guns at night without our knowledge because of the threat that somebody, the KKK or whatever, would be in there to try to kill my father.
In 1951, the Delane residence in Summerton, South Carolina was destroyed by arson. In October of 1955, Reverend Delane's church was burned, and 7 days later, his house was besieged by night riders. The armed Delane defended his home and possibly injured or killed a night rider.
My great-grandfather, Reverend J.A. Delane, was an American hero. He fought for a decent education for black children in Clarendon County. He stared racism and injustice in the face and never blinked.
In 1955, I was a 20-year-old senior at South Carolina State, and my involvement in the movement was influenced by a number of factors that existed in Orangeburg at the time. In 1954, there was a lady who worked, a black woman who worked at Snowflake Laundry and Dry Cleaners. And she had been slapped by her Caucasian boss because she refused to answer yes, sir, or no, sir. The NAACP, the local NAACP, sought a warrant for this white man's arrest, but of course, it was denied. Dr. Benjamin Payton, later Dr. Benjamin Payton, was the student body president, and he called a mass meeting. And at the mass meeting, it was unanimously decided that we would boycott Snowflake Laundry and Dry Cleaners. I had been elected unanimously as student body president, and so the 1954 Supreme Court decision was rendered. And sometimes between the fall of 55 and that decision, the Orangeburg NAACP decided that they would encourage black parents to ask the Orangeburg County School Board, which was all white, everything was all white, to integrate the Orangeburg County Public School in compliance with the 54 decision. The petition signed by the black parents was summarily rejected, and then a group of Orangeburg white businessmen formed what they called the White Citizens Council, the goal of which was to economically suppress those black parents who dared to sign that petition. I immediately proceeded to make an appointment with Dr. Turner, and once I made known my purpose of encouraging the student body to participate in the economic boycott, selective buying process, Dr. Turner snapped back. He was very angry and showed his anger. And his words to me were, look, we don't have any obligation to those people out there in the community. My job is to protect the welfare of 1,200 students, faculty, staff, and other people. And I'm not gonna play any damn hero. And you expect to get a degree from this institution, and I'm the president of the institution. And I'll let you be president of the student body, but I will not hesitate to send you home. Because of my involvement in the student movement, some of my friends who learned and expected that I might be expelled urged me to resign as student body president, but the preface would be to call a press conference, apologize to Dr. Turner, and then I would be spared and I could graduate. My niece broke into the conversation and she said, damn it, you, my grandmother struggled sold vegetables on the street to help get you to college, and you're going to play some damn hero. And I just very quietly told her, look, Rose, I'm sorry. I said, but, you know, your grandmother didn't raise a coward. The chairman of the board announced that, Mr. Moore, it's the unanimous decision of the board that you be expelled from this institution.
Fred Moore's First Amendment rights were trampled upon, and he was expelled from South Carolina State College 2 weeks before graduation. Fred graduated from Allen University in Columbia, South Carolina.
February the 8th, 1968, South Carolina State Highway Patrol officers fire on protesters near the college campus. 27 black protesters are injured, some shot in the back and the bottom of their feet. 3 persons are dead. U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark dismisses the claim that the officers were fired upon first by the students.
They committed murder. Murder, that's a harsh thing to say, but they did it. The police lost self-control. They just started shooting. It was a slaughter. Governor Robert McNair responded with excessive force because it was the politically expedient thing to do. Ramsey Clark, U.S. Attorney General, 1968. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, he'll empty his pockets for you. Lyndon B. Johnson, U.S. Senator, 36th President, United States of America.
Well, I grew up in the South. I grew up in a segregated South. Beaufort High School is where I graduated from, Beaufort, South Carolina in 1966. They integrated that year with the only black lawyer's son in Beaufort was the way they integrated the school. My father was in the military for 28 years, so I grew up in the military, which was integrated in a segregated South. And so I had that juxtaposition of living on integrated military bases and having friends of all different colors. We'd get on a military bus and they'd take us and they'd drop the white kids off at one school and take the black kids out to the fallen down school out on the islands. So it was pretty apparent to me, the disparity in the treatment there. My mother's father was from Atlanta and he was a stone cold racist. And my mother always took offense at that. And she raised me well. And she taught me early in the game that racism was a fool's game. If you go back not that far, like at a time when the mills in South Carolina, the textile mills, when they started letting black workers come, they went in the back door. But the white workers were oppressed and paid poorly, treated poorly, but they weren't black. And so that little bit of privilege, white skin privilege, that the people with the money that ran things allowed white working people to have is one of the fuels that fed the fires of racism, is that at least I'm not black.
This state, for example, has been very opposed to workers' rights. This is a state that has prided itself on being a right-to-work state. What does that mean? It means that people who work in this state literally have no right to job protections, no right to push for salary increases. They can be fired for no reason at all. And most people in the state who work every day really don't realize how at risk they are. One of the reasons that poverty sprawls in South Carolina the way that it does is because of the policies that we in the legislature and those in government have pushed for so many decades here. We have disempowered people, and we have made it impossible or very difficult for people to get pay increases, to work for pay increases. And if you're left at the mercies of business, what you find is that they're not willing to take profit from themselves. They want to keep as much profit for themselves as they possibly can. We've seen the rise of disparities in this country because what is true in South Carolina has been true all over America. We have seen the corporate sector reaping tremendous rewards on the backs of the working people in this country.
We are misled in believing that there is a unified white South, white front. The reality also is that throughout American history, the government, the church, labor unions have all tried to find ways to minimize any potential coalition among like-minded individuals, irregardless of race, irregardless of color. And so there have been moments in time where there were coalitions of Africans, Native Americans, and poor white people. And ways to thwart that coalition has always been by raising the flag of white supremacy. One of the great ironies is that people who seemingly should have shared interests are sort of fighting over minuscule resources. And that's been largely deliberate. And sort of those in power almost engineer it to be so. And that's been repeated throughout American history. Those in the civil rights movement recognize this as well, that one of the ways to try to advance the civil rights agenda would be to recognize that the battle is not simply about race, but also about class. And the war on poverty in the Lyndon Johnson administration tried to do that. And then, of course, right in that midst, there was something called the Southern Strategy, helped crafted by white South Carolinians and others, who said the way to thwart the Great Society, the way to thwart the war on poverty, would be to figure out a way to show that black people are benefiting more than poor white people.
The race question about poor whites and poor blacks, how come they don't really become allies or anything? Well, if you look at it, more poor blacks receive the welfare and everything, and poor whites, they just, they try to make ends meet. They try to do things mostly on their own. Another reason why I think blacks and whites don't really see themselves in the same predicament is, some blacks see racism everywhere. If I criticize the president, I'm deemed a racist by some people because I don't like what the president is doing. Well, I didn't like what Bill Clinton was doing sometimes. Am I a racist for that? No, I didn't even like some things that George W. Bush did, and I voted for him. Does that make me a racist? No. Some people see racism everywhere, and that's a problem.
The reason that I believe that poor whites and poor blacks don't see themselves as allies is because what's pushed to us on TV, what's given to us in the media. And a lot of people don't do their own research in the media, and what they see on the internet or what they see on television is their only tool to get information. So what we've been taught is white people versus black people, and you stick with that no matter your economic status, when truly, if you're poor, whether you're white, black, red, or green. So I think that's the reason they don't band together, because if they did, they would realize that poor white people and poor black people make up the majority of America, or the majority that can make a difference in politics and things like that if they were to come together.
I'm glad that you all decided to come and meet with us here today.
And we really just wanted to get your opinion about the country and your ideas on where the country is and the direction of the country. If you were a senator, a congressperson, president even, what are some things that are of particular importance to you?
To me, it's violence.
Okay.
Pure violence. You look at TV all the time, you see people killing each other every day. And it's to the fact that we're actually killing kids. Like, that'll be an issue that I will press really hard. And like the government now is still a big push for gun control. Well, it's not, you have to control the amount of guns that are on the streets too. But you also have to, the people who already have guns, you have to teach them more safety. It's really, really simple to get a weapon nowadays. You can literally buy it from somebody next door.
Right.
So you need to get a way to teach people, or to more enforce rules about the weapons.
Well, there's a lot of people who purchase it and they give it to them and they're not being responsible.
Right.
Because I've heard on the news in the mornings, like, whenever there's a child that grabbed a gun by accident and killed his mother.
Right.
That stuff happens a lot now, and like it's like it's stupid that people can't even put it high enough for a child not to reach it. You know what I mean? It's like now that you can just put it in the counter, someone can just grab it.
So being sure that if you have something with that important, you treat it with the responsibility and respect that it deserves.
I know some people, they don't want to pass gun control laws,
right.
And I'm just wondering why. Like, why not care about the next person? If you know, you see this continuously happening, why not put restrictions to try to limit the amount of deaths and all this horrible stuff?
I personally believe that people kill people, but it makes it a whole lot easier
right.
when you have a gun.
Right.
And we had a discussion about this in my 8th grade class and about gun control laws when after Sandy Hook happened. And almost everyone in my class said, well, people would still find ways to kill other people. And I was the one person who was like, it would be a whole lot harder to kill other people if it weren't if you didn't have a gun, if you didn't have an instant killer.
So we were talking about it earlier that oftentimes violence is a symptom of something that is more pervasive, more an underlying issue. What do we have to do about in regards to the way that we relate to other people?
For instance, the Santa Barbara shooting. I don't know if you guys saw the video that the shooter made.
Yeah. What was he talking about? What was he really talking about?
His social problem.
Right.
He thought that women owed him sex.
Right.
And people labeled him as mentally ill and said, "Oh, we can't take anything he said seriously. He was mentally ill."
Right.
But I think a huge focus when you were talking about what our issues would be, like if you were a senator. One of my huge pushes would be rape culture and this constant thought that women owe men their bodies and sex and things like that, when that's not the case. Like, our bodies belong to us, and of course not everyone believes that, but it's a very, very big arc, and a lot of people agree with that. And on the shooter's video, the comments said things like there were people commenting that they agreed with what he had done, and they would have done the same thing in that scenario.
Isn't that the most discouraging part, the most disheartening part when things like that happen?
I was almost sick when I was reading through them. I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. How can people think that?
And to your point, the sociology is what breeds, the same thing that breeds our fanaticism towards objects, and that same sense of enthusiasm, that same vigor we don't exhibit towards other people. And you were talking about the sociology course. I think some of what you're talking about is sort of connected, that we need to be more critical about how we treat other people and what socializes that rape culture that you just talked about. So I agree wholeheartedly. Like, you all have some really, really, really amazing ideas.
Sometimes, as I sit communing in my study, I feel that death is not far off. I am aware that it will overtake me before the greatest of my dreams, full equality for the Negro in our time is realized. Yet, I face that reality without fear or regret. I am resigned to death as all humans must be at the proper time. Death neither alarms nor frightens one who has had a long career of fruitful toil. The knowledge that my work has been helpful to many fills me with joy and great satisfaction. Since my retirement from an active role in educational work and from the affairs of the National Council of Negro Women, I've been living quietly and working at my desk at my home here in Florida. The years have directed a change of pace for me. I am now 78 years old, and my activities are no longer so strenuous as they once were. I feel that I must conserve my strength to finish the work at hand. Already I've begun working on my autobiography, which will record my life journey in detail. Together with the innumerable side trips, which have carried me abroad into every corner of our country, into homes both lowly and luxurious, and even into the White House to confer with presidents. I have also deeded my home and its contents to the Mary Bethune Foundation, organized in March 1953 for research, interracial activity, and the sponsorship of wider educational opportunities.
Sometimes I ask myself if I have any other legacies to leave. Truly, my worldly possessions are few, yet my experiences have been rich. From them, I have distilled principles and policies in which I believe firmly, for they represent the meaning of my life's work. They are the products of much sweat and sorrow. Perhaps in them, there is something of value. So as I draw my life to a close, I will pass them on to Negroes everywhere in the hope that an old woman's philosophy may give them inspiration. Here then is my legacy. I leave you love. Love builds. It is positive and helpful. It is more beneficial than hate. Injury is quickly forgotten, quickly pass away. Personally and racially, our enemies must be forgiven. Our aim must be to create a world of justice and fellowship where no man's skin, color, or religion is held against him. Love thy neighbor is a precept which could transform the world if it were universally practiced. It connotes brotherhood, and to me, brotherhood of men is the noblest in all human relations. Loving your neighbor means being interracial, interreligious, and international.
I leave you hope. The Negro's growth will be great in the years to come. Yesterday, our ancestors endured the degradation of slavery, yet they retained their dignity. Today, we direct our economic and political strength toward winning a more abundant and secure life. Tomorrow, a new Negro, unhindered by race, taboos, and shackles, will benefit from more than 330 years of ceaseless striving and struggle. Theirs will be a better world. This I believe with all my heart.
I leave you the challenge of developing confidence in one another. As long as Negroes are hemmed into racial blocks by prejudice and pressure, it will be necessary for them to band together for economic betterment. Negro banks, insurance companies, and other businesses are examples of successful racial economic enterprises. These institutions were made possible by vision and mutual aid. Confidence was vital in getting them started and keeping them going. Negroes have still got to demonstrate still more confidence in each other in business. This kind of confidence will aid the economic rise of the race by bringing together the pennies and dollars of our people and plowing them into useful channels. Economic separatism cannot be tolerated in this enlightened age, and it is not practicable. We must spread out as far as we can, as fast as we can, but we must also help each other as we go.
I leave you a thirst for education. Knowledge is the prime need of the hour. More and more Negroes are taking full advantage of the hard-won opportunities for learning. And the educational level of the Negro population is at its highest point in history. We are making greater use of the privileges inherent in living a democracy. If we continue in this trend, we will be able to rear increasing numbers of strong, purposeful men and women equipped with vision, mental clarity, health, and education.
I leave you respect for the uses of power. Power, intelligently used, can lead to more freedom. Unwisely directed, power can become a more dreadful and destructive force. In my lifetime, I have seen the power of the Negro grow enormously. It has always been my first concern that we place this power on the right side of human justice. Now that the barriers are crumbling everywhere, The Negro in America must ever be vigilant lest his forces be marshaled behind wrong causes and undemocratic movements. He must not lend any support to any group that seeks to subvert democracy. That's why we must elect leaders who are wise, courageous, and above their moral stature and ability. We have great leaders among us today: Ralph Bunche, Shannon Tobias, Mordecai Johnson, Walter White, and Mary Church Terrell. We have had other great men and women in the past: Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman. We must produce more qualified people like them, who will not work for themselves, but for others.
I leave you faith. Faith is the first factor in a life devoted to service. Without faith, nothing is possible. With it, nothing is impossible. In 50 years, the faith of the American Negro in himself has grown immensely and is still increasing. The measure of our progress as a race is in precise relation to the depth of the faith of our people held by our leaders. Frederick Douglass, genius though he was spurred in a deep conviction that his people would heed his counsel and follow him to freedom. Our forefathers struggled for liberty in conditions far more wondrous than we now face. Their perseverance paid rich dividends. We must never forget their sufferings and sacrifices, for they were the foundation of the progress of our people.
I leave you racial dignity. I want Negroes to maintain human dignity at all costs. We as Negroes must recognize that we are the custodians as well as the heirs of a great civilization. We have given something to the world as a race, and for this, we are proud and fully conscious of our place in the total picture of mankind's developments. We must learn also to share and mix with all men. We must make an effort to be less race conscious and more conscious of individual and human values. I have never been sensitive about my complexion. My color has never destroyed my self-respect, nor has it ever caused me to conduct myself in such a way to manner the disrespect of any person. I have not let my color handicap me. Despite many crushing burdens and handicaps, I have risen from the cotton fields of South Carolina to found a college, administer it during its years of growth, become a public servant in the government of our country, and a leader of women. I would not exchange my color for all the wealth in the world, for if I had been born white, I might not have been able to do all that I have done or yet hope to do.
I leave you a desire to live harmoniously with your fellow man. The problem of color is worldwide. It is found in Africa, in Asia, Europe, and South America. I appeal to American Negroes, North, South, East, and West, to recognize their common problem and unite to solve them. I pray we will learn to live harmoniously with the white race. So often our difficulties have made us hypersensitive and truculent. I want to see my people conduct themselves naturally in all relationships, fully conscious of their manly responsibilities and deeply aware of their heritage. I want them to learn to understand whites and influence them for good, for it is advisable and sensible for us to do so. We are a minority of 15 million living side by side with the white majority. We must learn to deal with these people positively and on an individual basis.
I leave you finally a responsibility to our young people. The world around us really belongs to the youth, for the youth will take over its future management. Our children must never lose their zeal for building a better world. They must not get discouraged from aspiring towards greatness, nor must they forget that the masses of our people are still underprivileged, ill-housed, impoverished, and victimized by discrimination. We have a powerful potential in our youth. We must have the courage to change old ideas and practices so that we may direct their power towards good ends. Faith, courage, brotherhood, dignity, ambition, responsibility. These are needed today as never before. We must cultivate them and use them as tools in our task of completing the establishment of equality for the Negro. We must sharpen these tools in the struggle that faces us and find new ways of using them. The freedom gates are half ajar. We must pry them fully open. If I have a legacy to leave my people, it is my philosophy of living and serving. As I face tomorrow, I am content, for I think I have spent my life well. I pray now that my philosophy may be helpful to those who share a vision of a world of peace, progress, brotherhood, and love.